There is a silence that settles over the Loire Valley in the hour before dawn, a particular stillness that has remained unchanged for 5 centuries. The mist rises from the Casson River, threading through ancient oaks and across clearings where wild boar still move through the undergrowth, and it pools in the hollows of the parkland before climbing, slowly, toward something immense that emerges from the darkness like a dream-made stone. At first, there is only an outline against the violet sky, a roofline too complicated to be real, towers multiplying where there should be none, chimneys and lanterns and spiraling pinnacles rising in such profusion that they seem less like architecture than like some organic growth that is sprouted from the earth itself. As the light strengthens, that thin silver light of early morning in central France, the scale becomes clear, and the scale is impossible. This is Chambord, and nothing in Europe has ever looked quite like it. The castle stretches 156 meters along its principal facade, a length that takes nearly 2 minutes to walk at a leisurely pace. Its 4 massive corner towers rise 56 meters into the sky, their conical slate roofs visible for kilometers across the flat landscape of the Sologne. Between these towers, the central keep erupts in a forest of ornamental stonework so dense that early visitors struggled to count its elements, and some still do today. There are 800 sculpted columns. There are hundreds of capitals, each carved with a different design. There are dormers within dormers, lanterns stacked upon lanterns, and at the absolute center of it all, a single great tower crowned with the fleur-de-lis of France, rising from a roofscape that contains more carved stone than some entire cathedrals. This building covers an area of more than 4,600 square meters. It contains 440 rooms. It incorporates 84 staircases, including one that would become the most famous piece of architectural engineering in French history. Its surrounding park, still enclosed by the longest wall in France at 32 kilometers, encompasses 54 square kilometers of forest, an area larger than the city of Paris within the périphérique. And yet here, in this morning mist, what strikes you most is not the grandeur. It is the silence, the profound, almost unsettling emptiness of a place built to accommodate 1,000 courtiers, but which, across 5 centuries of existence, has been truly inhabited for only a handful of years. This is the essential paradox of Chambord. It is perhaps the most ambitious domestic structure ever conceived in Europe, a building that consumed more resources, more labor, more imagination than almost any other palace of its era. Yet it was never actually lived in, never completed as its creator imagined, never incorporated into the daily rhythms of monarchy in the way its builders intended. It was built for ambition, not for life. And that distinction would shape everything that followed. To understand how such a building came to exist, and more importantly, how it has managed to survive, requires traveling back 500 years to a moment when a young king looked out across the marshlands of the Sologne and saw not what was there, but what might be made to rise from nothing. The year is 1519. Francis I has been King of France for 4 years, ascending to the throne at the age of 20 after the death of his cousin Louis XIII. He is 25 years old. He is extraordinarily tall for his era, nearly 2 meters, with an athletic build, a prominent nose, and an energy that contemporaries describe as almost overwhelming. He hunts with a ferocity that exhausts his companions. He dances until the musicians collapse. He pursues women with a persistence that scandalizes even the famously tolerant French court. And he builds. This is the essential fact of Francis's character. He builds. He's not merely a patron of architecture in the manner of previous kings, commissioning additions to existing structures or funding religious foundations. He is a creator in the most active sense, personally engaged with plans and drawings, debating with architects and engineers, visiting construction sites, and modifying designs on the spot. He has already transformed the Château of Amboise, begun expansions at Blois, and is contemplating works at Fontainebleau that would occupy decades. But none of these satisfy his vision. He wants something entirely new, something that has never existed before. The site he chooses seems almost perverse. The Salon is not prime real estate. It is a flat, marshy expanse of poorly drained land, plagued by insects in summer and bitter cold in winter. The soil is sandy and acidic. The nearest substantial town, Blois, lies 15 kilometers away across difficult terrain. There's a modest hunting lodge here, built by the Counts of Blois, but nothing to suggest that this location could support one of the largest construction projects in European history. Yet the difficulties are precisely the point. Francis does not want to build upon foundations laid by others. He does not want to modify, to extend, to improve. He wants to create ex nihilo, from nothing, a building that will be entirely his own, a statement of such absolute magnificence that it will establish France as the equal of Italy in artistic achievement and himself as the equal of any prince who has ever lived. This is not purely ego, though ego plays its part. Francis has experienced something that has marked him profoundly. In 1515, just months after becoming king, he led his army across the Alps and won a stunning victory against the Swiss at the Battle of Marignano, securing control of Milan and making France the dominant power in northern Italy. But the conquest was not merely military. It was aesthetic. Francis saw the palaces of Milan, the villas of Rome, the churches of Florence. He saw what Italian architects and artists had achieved during the previous century, the rediscovery and reinvention of classical forms, the mathematical precision, the harmony of proportion. And he understood that France, for all its power, remained architecturally provincial. He began importing Italian artists almost immediately. Leonardo da Vinci arrived at Amboise in 1516, already elderly and failing, carrying with him a small collection of paintings, including the Mona Lisa, and notebook filled with architectural drawings and engineering concepts. Leonardo would die in France in 1519, the very year that Chambord's construction began, and the question of his influence on the building's design would become one of architecture's most tantalizing mysteries. What we know is this: the double helix staircase at the heart of Chambord, an extraordinary structure in which two interlocking spirals allow people to ascend and descend simultaneously without ever meeting, bears a striking resemblance to drawings in Leonardo's notebooks. The centralized plan of the keep, with its Greek cross layout and mathematical symmetry, reflects Italian theoretical ideals that Leonardo knew intimately. The sophisticated engineering required to construct such a staircase, with its hollow central shaft and precisely calculated stone treads, suggests knowledge that existed nowhere in France but was common among Italian engineer architects. Yet there is no documentary proof that Leonardo designed Chambord. The building's primary architect appears to have been Domenico da Cortona, an Italian woodworker who had arrived in France years earlier and worked on various royal projects. But Cortona was a maker of models, not a trained architect in the Italian theoretical tradition, and many scholars believe he was working from concepts developed by others, perhaps Leonardo, perhaps members of Leonardo's circle, perhaps a collaboration that will never be fully untangled. What matters for our purposes is not the attribution, but the intention. Chambord was conceived from its very beginning as a synthesis, a building that would take the theoretical ambitions of Italian Renaissance architecture and translate them into a French idiom, creating something that had never existed in either tradition. It would be classical in its proportions and symmetry, but Gothic in its vertical energy and ornamental exuberance. It would be rational in its underlying geometry, but romantic in its effect. It would be, above all, astonishing. Francis approved the designs, the site was cleared, and in September of 1519, the first foundations were laid. Neither the king nor anyone else involved could have imagined what the next 28 years would bring. To build Chambord required first confronting an almost impossible engineering challenge. The site selected by Francis was, as noted, marshland, ground so soft and unstable that conventional foundations would simply sink into the muck. Before a single decorative stone could be carved, before the famous staircase could rise, before any of the grandeur visible today could take shape, the builders had to create solid ground where none existed. The solution was brutal in its simplicity and staggering in its scale. Workers drove oak pilings deep into the marsh, thousands upon thousands of them, creating a subterranean forest of timber that would distribute the building's weight across a wider area and anchor the foundations to more stable strata below. Contemporary records are incomplete, but modern archaeological surveys suggest that the piling work alone required stripping entire forests of mature oak, transporting the logs to the site, shaping them, and driving them into the wet ground using pile drivers operated by teams of laborers working in shifts. The logistics of this work are difficult to overstate. There were no mechanical pile drivers. Each log was lifted by human and animal power, positioned over its intended location, and hammered down by the repeated dropping of a heavy weight, a process that might need to be repeated hundreds of times for a single pile. The workers stood in water and mud. They were bitten by insects. They contracted fevers from the swampy conditions. Many of them died. Above the pilings, workers laid courses of massive limestone blocks quarried from the region around Bourges, 50 kilometers to the east. This stone, known as tuffeau, is relatively soft when first cut, a quality that allowed the intricate carving for which Chambord is famous, but hardened significantly upon exposure to air. Transporting it required an elaborate network of barges moving along the rivers of the Loire system, as well as carts drawn by oxen along roads that barely deserved the name. The scale of stone required was almost beyond comprehension. Modern estimates suggest that Chambord incorporates approximately 220,000 tons of masonry. This is not merely a large quantity. It represents one of the largest masonry buildings constructed in Europe during the 16th century. To quarry, transport, and place this much stone required not just workers, but an entire economic system: quarry operators, barge captains, road maintenance crews, blacksmiths to maintain tools, bakers to feed workers, carpenters to construct scaffolding, rope makers to supply rigging. At its peak, the Chambord construction site employed somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 workers simultaneously. This was not a small town. It was a small city, arising in the middle of nowhere with all the organizational challenges that implies. Workers needed housing. They needed food and water. They needed medical care when injured, which was often. They needed supervision to ensure they actually worked rather than wandering off or fighting among themselves. They needed payment, which meant a constant flow of currency or equivalent exchange from the royal treasury. The master craftsmen, the skilled stone carvers who created the ornamental elements, occupied the top of this hierarchy. They were paid relatively well, perhaps 3 or 4 times what ordinary laborers received, and they possessed specialized knowledge that made them nearly irreplaceable. Below them came the journeymen, competent workers still learning their trade. At the bottom were the laborers, the men who mixed mortar and carried stones and cleared debris, who did the dangerous and exhausting work that kept the construction moving forward. Francis Theron visited the site whenever possible, sometimes staying for weeks at a time in temporary structures erected for his accommodation. He cared intensely about every detail. Contemporary accounts describe him climbing scaffolding to inspect carving work, debating with architects about the placement of windows, modifying designs to reflect his latest ideas. The building evolved as it rose, which created enormous complications for the builders, but reflected Francis's restless improvisational approach to creation. This constant modification had consequences. Walls that had been completed had to be partially dismantled. Foundations that had been laid for one design proved inadequate for another. The laborers who had driven pilings for a structure of one size found themselves driving additional pilings when the plans expanded. Nothing was ever truly finished, because nothing was ever truly final in the king's imagination. And then there were the interruptions. In 1521, war broke out between Francis and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a conflict that would dominate the middle decades of Francis's reign and drain enormous resources from the French treasury. Construction at Chambord slowed but did not stop entirely. Francis was too committed to abandon his dream, but the workforce shrank and the pace of building dropped dramatically. In 1525, disaster struck. At the Battle of Pavia, Francis himself was captured by imperial forces, an almost unprecedented humiliation for a reigning monarch. He was held prisoner in Madrid for more than a year, forced to sign a treaty surrendering vast territories, and returned to France only after leaving his 2 eldest sons as hostages to guarantee his compliance with terms he had no intention of honoring. During his captivity, construction at Chambord ceased almost entirely. There was no money, there was no royal oversight, there was no certainty that Francis would ever return. The workers dispersed, the scaffolding rotted, the unfinished wall stood open to the weather, but Francis did return, and almost immediately he resumed building. This says something essential about his psychology. A more practical monarch might have abandoned the project, recognizing that the political and military challenges facing France demanded every available resource. A more cautious ruler might have scaled back, building something smaller but actually completable. Francis did neither. If anything, his ambition intensified. The humiliation of Pavia, the experience of imprisonment, of seeing his sons led away as hostages, of confronting his own mortality and vulnerability, seems to have reinforced rather than diminished his need for a monument that would outlast all such temporary setbacks. The construction continued for another 2 decades, though never at the pace of those first years. Francis would live to see the keep essentially completed, the 4 corner towers, the central lantern, the famous double helix staircase, the main reception rooms. But he would not see the wings that were intended to extend from the keep, connecting to additional towers and courtyards that would have more than doubled the building's size. He would not see the park fully enclosed. He would not see the sophisticated water systems that were planned but never implemented. He died in 1547, 28 years after breaking ground, having visited Chambord for perhaps 72 nights in total across his entire reign. 72 nights. In a building that consumed what would amount to billions of modern euros, that employed thousands of workers over decades, that stands today as one of the most recognizable structures in European history. 72 nights. To understand why Chambord was never truly inhabited, one must understand what it was like to actually be there. The building's magnificence, which reads so clearly in photographs and descriptions, was largely aesthetic rather than practical. It was designed to impress, not to shelter. And the realities of 16th century life made this distinction extraordinarily uncomfortable. Consider heating. The Loire Valley winters are not severe by European standards, but they are cold. Temperatures regularly drop below freezing, and the damp that rises from the surrounding marshland penetrates everything. Chambord has somewhere between 300 and 365 fireplaces, depending on how one counts chimney stacks with multiple openings. This sounds adequate until one considers the volume of space those fireplaces were expected to warm. The main rooms of the keep have ceilings between 7 and 9 meters high. The stone walls are between 2 and 4 meters thick. The windows, while generous for the period, allowed substantial heat loss. To raise the temperature of such a space to a comfortable level required burning truly extraordinary quantities of wood, quantities that the surrounding forest could supply, but that required enormous labor to cut, transport, and stack, and that produced a heating effect concentrated near the fireplace while leaving the rest of the room frigid. Contemporary accounts describe courtiers huddling in furs, their breath visible as they spoke. They describe the elaborate rituals required to make the king's bedchamber tolerable. Multiple fires lit hours before the king arrived, heated bricks wrapped in cloth and placed in the bed, heavy curtains drawn around sleeping areas to trap body heat. Despite all this, the cold penetrated. It made joints ache. It made fingers clumsy. It made life at Chambord during winter months a physical ordeal rather than a pleasure. Then there was water. The original plans for Chambord included sophisticated hydraulic systems that would have brought water from the Casson River directly into the building, with fountains in the courtyards and running water in at least some of the principal apartments. These systems were never completed. Instead, water had to be drawn from wells and carried by hand up the stairs, the very same beautiful stairs that modern visitors admire, by servants whose entire working lives consisted of climbing and descending with heavy vessels. Sanitation presented even greater challenges. Chambord was designed in an era before modern plumbing, before the germ theory of disease, before any systematic understanding of waste disposal. The building incorporated privies, small closets with holes in the floor leading to cesspits below, but these were primitive, malodorous, and insufficient for a court that might number in the hundreds during royal visits. The rest of the sanitary needs were met by chamber pots, which servants emptied into the surrounding grounds, and by the simple expedient of going outdoors when weather permitted. The smell of a large 16th century establishment is difficult for modern people to imagine. There was the smell of wood smoke, ever present from hundreds of fires. There was the smell of horses and their manure from the stables. There was the smell of cooking from kitchens designed to feed hundreds. There was the smell of unwashed bodies. Even the king bathed only rarely by modern standards, and of the perfumes used to mask those bodies. There was the smell of tallow candles. There was the smell of the hunt, of dead animals being processed for food, of dogs and their waste. And there was the smell of human waste, never adequately contained or removed. Chambord, in short, was spectacular to look at, but miserable to inhabit for any extended period. It was a stage set, designed for the performance of monarchy rather than for the living of life. And Francis seems to have understood this, which is why his visits were so brief. Intense periods of display and hunting, followed by retreat to more comfortable residences at Blois or Fontainebleau. But if the king found Chambord uncomfortable, imagine what it was like for the servants who made those brief royal visits possible. To prepare for a royal arrival required a small army of workers descending on the building weeks in advance. The rooms had to be cleaned of the dust and debris that accumulated during months of emptiness. The fireplaces had to be cleared, inspected, and repaired. The wells had to be checked and cleaned. The stables had to be prepared for horses. Food had to be laid in, not just the provisions for the visit itself, but the food required to sustain the preparatory workforce. Then the king would arrive with his court, a traveling circus of nobles, servants, guards, clergy, musicians, artists, and hangers-on that might number anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people. And for a few days or weeks, Chambord would blaze with life. Hunting parties would depart at dawn, banquets would continue until midnight, the chapel would fill with the sound of masses sung by the king's personal choir. The staircases would echo with footsteps and conversation, and then, just as suddenly, it would end. The king would depart for his next destination, and behind him would come another army of servants, cleaning up, packing away, closing down. The fires would go cold, the kitchens would empty, the rooms would fill with dust sheets and silence, and Chambord would return to its essential state, magnificent, empty, and waiting. Francis Fern died in 1547. His son Henry II showed little interest in Chambord, preferring the hunting at Fontainebleau and the proximity to Paris. The building continued to deteriorate slowly, not from neglect exactly, but from the simple fact that a building of this scale and complexity requires constant attention, and without a resident monarch, that attention was sporadic at best. The subsequent history of Chambord is largely a history of abandonment, punctuated by brief revivals. Henry III visited occasionally. Henry IV showed somewhat more interest, recognizing the building's symbolic value even if he too found it uncomfortable. But none of Francis's successors shared his passionate identification with the building. It remained crown property, but never became a true royal residence. The 17th century brought a significant change. Louis XIV, the Sun King, inherited Chambord as part of the royal domain and initially seemed prepared to invest in its restoration. He commissioned the great architect Jules Ardouin-Mansart to study the building and propose improvements. Some work was done. The second floor was fitted out more comfortably, and the external forecourt was enclosed with low service buildings. Louis visited several times and even commissioned Molière to premiere a new comedy there in 1670. But Louis's attention was ultimately captured by a different project, Versailles. The vast palace complex he created outside Paris would become the new center of French monarchy, absorbing resources that might otherwise have gone to maintaining structures like Chambord. After 1685, Louis never returned to the Loire Valley. The building reverted to its familiar pattern of silent waiting. The 18th century brought the most significant sustained occupation in Chambord's history, though it came from an unexpected source. In 1725, the exiled king Stanisław Leszczyński of Poland was granted the use of the chateau by his son-in-law Louis XIII. Stanisław, deposed from his throne by Russian intervention, would live at Chambord for 8 years with his small court, making it perhaps the only period when the building functioned as something like a permanent residence. Even this occupation was limited. Stanisław's court numbered only a few hundred at most. Large portions of the building remained closed. The maintenance backlog continued to grow. And when Stanisław departed to become Duke of Lorraine in 1733, Chambord again fell empty. The following decade saw a parade of temporary occupants, a succession of military governors, none resident for long, a series of proposals for alternative uses, none implemented, a gradual decay that began to affect not just comfort but structural integrity. Roofs leaked, masonry crumbled, the elaborate carved ornaments of the roofscape, exposed to centuries of Loire Valley weather, slowly eroded. Then came the Revolution. In 1789, the people of France rose against their monarchy, beginning a process that would transform every aspect of French society. Chambord, as crown property, became national property, the property of a nation that had little use for symbols of royal extravagance and less money to maintain them. The revolutionary period was catastrophic for French cultural heritage. Churches were desecrated, palaces were stripped of their furnishings, art was destroyed or sold, the bodies of kings were exhumed from their tombs and thrown into common graves. Chambord escaped the worst of this destruction. Its remote location protected it from the most violent phases of revolutionary fervor. But it did not escape entirely. The furniture was sold. Every piece of movable property that Francis the Iron and his successors had placed in the building was auctioned off in sales that lasted for weeks, dispersing across France and Europe objects that would never be recovered. The building itself was put up for sale as national property, though no buyer came forward willing to take on a structure of such size with no practical purpose. For nearly 2 decades, Chambord stood as a kind of architectural orphan, owned by the nation, maintained by no one, slowly crumbling. The revolutionary and Napoleonic governments had wars to fight and empires to build. A 16th-century hunting lodge, however magnificent, simply did not feature in their calculations. The building's salvation, such as it was, came from an unlikely source. In 1821, a national subscription was organized to purchase Chambord for the Duke of Bordeaux, the infant nephew of the last Bourbon king and legitimist claimant to the French throne. The purchase was both a financial transaction and a political statement, an assertion that the old monarchy was not dead, that the Bourbon line continued, that the future might yet belong to the past. The young duke, who would grow up to be known as the Count of Chambord after this very building, inherited a structure in serious disrepair. He would spend decades organizing and financing restoration work, though his political exile meant he rarely visited in person. When he finally did arrive in 1871, it was as a pretender to the throne of a country that had again abolished its monarchy, and his visit lasted only 3 days before he departed, never to return. The Count of Chambord died in 1883 without heirs, bequeathing the chateau to his nephew, the Duke of Parma, and beginning another period of complicated ownership that would eventually see the building return to state hands. In 1930, the French government purchased Chambord from the princes of Bourbon-Parma, and for the first time since the Revolution, the building's future seemed secure. But security did not mean prosperity. The France of 1930 was a country still recovering from the devastation of the First World War, facing economic depression and watching with growing alarm the rise of fascism across its borders. Resources for heritage preservation were limited. Chambord received attention sufficient to prevent collapse, but not enough to reverse the accumulated damage of centuries. And then came the Second World War. September 1939. German armies have invaded Poland, and France has declared war in response. Though fighting has not yet reached French soil, the government recognizes that the treasures of the nation are at risk. In one of history's great cultural rescue operations, the collections of the Louvre and other major museums are packed into crates and evacuated to chateaux in the Loire Valley, where they will be safer from bombing and potential seizure. Chambord becomes one of the primary repositories for this displaced heritage. Crates containing some of the world's most famous paintings are stacked in the great rooms where Francis I once hosted hunting parties. The Mona Lisa herself, the very painting that Leonardo carried to France in 1516 and that may have been at Chambord when its plans were being developed, returns to the region 4 centuries later, hidden in a plain wooden box. The German occupation of France from 1940 to 1944 put this treasure in constant danger. Nazi artificials knew generally where the evacuated collections were hidden and periodically attempted to inventory them for potential seizure. The curators who remained at Chambord engaged in a delicate dance, cooperating enough to avoid reprisals while concealing the full extent and value of what they protected. When liberation came in 1944, Chambord had survived the war largely intact. The art was eventually returned to Paris. The building itself, having served its first genuinely useful purpose in 4 centuries, reverted to its familiar silence. But the war had changed everything about the economics of heritage preservation. France was impoverished, its infrastructure destroyed, its population exhausted. The grand chateau of the Loire Valley, already financial burdens before the war, now seemed almost impossibly expensive to maintain. Something had to change. The answer, as it would be for grand estates across Europe, was tourism. The transformation of Chambord from private folly to public attraction unfolded gradually across the post-war decades. It was not a dramatic pivot, but rather a slow realization, by government officials, by cultural administrators, by the general public, that buildings like Chambord could not survive on historical importance alone. They needed to generate revenue. They needed to earn their keep. The first challenge was physical access. Chambord, deliberately built in the middle of nowhere, was not easy to reach. The roads were poor. Public transportation was non-existent. The surrounding region, the Sologne, remained thinly populated and economically marginal. Visitors who wanted to experience the chateau had to be committed enough to find their way there on their own. Gradually, the infrastructure improved. Roads were widened and paved. Parking areas were created. Signage appeared on the regional highways. The French government, recognizing that tourism could become a significant economic sector, began investing in the promotion of sites like Chambord as part of the national heritage brand. By the 1970s, visitation had grown to several 100,000 annually. By the 1990s, it approached 1 million. Today, Chambord typically receives between 800,000 and 1 million visitors per year, making it one of the most visited monuments in France outside Paris. But the economics of heritage tourism are more complicated than simply counting visitors. Each person who enters Chambord pays an admission fee, and those fees constitute a significant revenue stream. Yet the fees must be set carefully, high enough to generate meaningful income, low enough to not discourage visitation, and calibrated against the competitive landscape of other attractions in the region. The Loire Valley alone contains dozens of visitable chateaux, and visitors have choices. Beyond admission, there are secondary revenue streams. There's a gift shop selling books, postcards, and souvenirs. There's a restaurant. There are special events, concerts, theatrical performances, nighttime illuminations that command premium prices. There are rental fees for filming, which bring substantial income when productions choose Chambord as a location. There is the income from a small hotel that has been established in the former service buildings. And then there's the most unexpected revenue stream of all: wine. In the year 2015, Chambord began producing its own wine from vineyards established within the historic park, reviving a tradition that dates back to the 16th century. The project was modest at first, only a few hectares under cultivation, but it has expanded and now produces several thousand bottles annually. This is not merely symbolic. The wine generates real income and serves as part of a broader strategy to make the estate economically productive rather than purely consumptive. Yet for all these diversified revenues, Chambord does not pay for itself. The gap between what the chateau generates and what it costs to maintain remains substantial, and that gap must be filled by public subsidy, by French taxpayers who fund the preservation of a building that most of them will never visit. This raises questions that have no easy answers. How much should a society invest in preserving monuments to its past? What is the economic value of cultural heritage? How do we balance the claims of history against the needs of the present? These questions hover over every major heritage site in the world, and Chambord is no exception. To understand the scale of ongoing investment required, consider what it takes simply to keep the building standing. The roofscape of Chambord, that extraordinary assembly of towers, chimneys, dormers, and lanterns that is the chateau's most recognizable feature, covers approximately 5,000 square meters. It is constructed primarily of slate, a durable material, but one that still requires periodic replacement as individual slates crack, shift, or weather away. A comprehensive reslating of the roof would cost tens of millions of euros and require years of work. Instead, the maintenance is continuous. Teams of specialized craftsmen working permanently on different sections, replacing damaged slates, repointing lead flashings, inspecting and repairing the structural timber beneath. The carved stonework presents even greater challenges. The tuffeau limestone from which Chambord is constructed is relatively soft. This is what allowed the intricate carving in the first place. Craftsmen could achieve remarkable detail because the stone yielded to their chisels, but it also means the stone is vulnerable to weathering. Rain penetrates. Frost expands within the stone and cracks it. Pollution deposits acids that eat away its surfaces. And biological growth, lichens, mosses, algae, gradually colonizes every exposed surface. Walking the roofscape of Chambord is like walking through a sculpture garden under assault. Capitals that were once sharply carved have softened into indistinct lumps. Faces on decorative figures have eroded away. The intricate fleur-de-lis that crown the towers have lost their definition. The process is slow, measured in decades and centuries rather than years, but it is inexorable. Without intervention, every carved surface will eventually dissolve into formlessness. The intervention is painstaking and expensive. Conservators work stone by stone, analyzing the condition of each element and prescribing treatment. Some stones can be cleaned and stabilized where they sit. Others must be replaced with new stone, carved to match the original design, a process that requires skilled craftsmen becoming increasingly rare, and materials that are becoming increasingly expensive as the historic quarries are exhausted. Still, others are beyond saving and must be documented, removed, and stored, their loss recorded as part of the building's biography. Then there are the systems, the hidden infrastructure that makes the building function. Unlike Francis I's original chateau, modern Chambord has heating. A system of oil-fired boilers installed in underground chambers well away from the historic fabric generates hot water that circulates through radiators discreetly placed in the most heavily used spaces. The system is expensive to operate, Heating oil is not cheap and contributes to ongoing environmental costs that the administration is working to address. Plans are underway to transition to more sustainable energy sources, but each change requires careful study to ensure it does not damage the historic structure. There is electricity, of course, wiring installed in the 20th century that allows lighting, security systems, and the technology required for modern museum operations. This wiring must be maintained and periodically upgraded, work that requires cutting into historic fabric with extreme care. There is plumbing for the restrooms used by visitors, the kitchen facilities, the administrative offices. There is drainage, both for wastewater and for stormwater, that must be managed to prevent erosion around the foundations. There is fire suppression, not easy to achieve in a building where historic fabric and electronic systems create complex fire loads and where water damage from suppression systems might be as destructive as fire itself. All of this requires people. The public-facing staff, the guards, the guides, the ticket sellers, the shop employees are only part of the workforce. Behind them is a larger team of maintenance workers, gardeners, conservators, administrators, educators, archivists, and specialists. The total workforce at Chambord exceeds 200 permanent employees, plus seasonal workers and outside contractors brought in for specific projects. This workforce must be paid, housed, and supported. Some live in the remaining residential buildings within the park, creating a small community that maintains the chateau's presence even when visitors are absent. Others commute from Blois or other nearby towns. All require salaries and benefits that constitute the largest single category of ongoing expense. And beyond the human costs are the natural ones. The park surrounding Chambord, those 54 square kilometers of forest and wetland, is not simply decoration. It is a working ecosystem that requires management. The forest includes significant timber resources that generate modest income when harvested sustainably. But forestry in a historic park is not like forestry in a commercial operation. Trees cannot be cut without consideration of their aesthetic and historical significance. Harvesting methods must protect the soil and waterways. Dead trees must sometimes be left standing for wildlife habitat. The forest is managed for ecological health and visitor experience, not for maximum timber production. The wetlands present their own challenges. The Casson River flows through the park, and its waters must be managed to prevent both flooding and drought. The marshes that made Francis I's original construction so difficult now serve as wildlife habitat that must be preserved and maintained. Invasive species must be controlled. Native species must be monitored. The entire landscape is a managed artifact, not a natural wilderness. And then there is the wall, that 32-kilometer enclosure that defines the park boundary and prevents public access except through controlled points. It too must be maintained, its stonework repointed, its gates secured, its integrity preserved against the constant pressure of vegetation and weather and human encroachment. The financial reality of Chambord in the 21st century is thus a complex balance sheet in which multiple revenue streams contend against equally multiple cost centers, and in which the balance almost never comes out in favor of surplus. The annual budget of the Chambord National Estate runs to approximately 15 million euros. Of this, roughly half comes from self-generated revenues, admission fees, shop sales, restaurant income, filming permits, wine sales, rental of spaces for events. The remainder comes from state subsidy, direct grants from the French Ministry of Culture that cover the gap between what the estate can earn and what it needs to survive. This subsidy is not guaranteed. Each year, the administration must justify its budget request against competing claims from other cultural institutions. Each year, the argument must be made anew that Chambord represents a legitimate use of public funds, that preserving this monument to royal ambition serves contemporary French society in ways that justify diverting resources from schools, hospitals, roads, and other pressing needs. The arguments are several. There is the economic argument that tourism at Chambord generates secondary spending in the region, hotels, restaurants, shops, that returns more to the local economy than the public subsidy costs. There is the cultural argument that Chambord represents French heritage in a way that cannot be measured in economic terms, that it contributes to national identity and historical consciousness. There is the international argument that sites like Chambord draw foreign visitors to France, contributing to the tourism industry that is one of the country's largest economic sectors. These arguments have prevailed so far. The subsidy continues, the doors remain open, the conservation work proceeds. But there's no guarantee that this will always be the case. Economic crises, political changes, shifting priorities, any of these could disrupt the delicate financial equilibrium that keeps Chambord functioning. And so the administration pursues diversification with increasing urgency. The wine production expands. The events program grows more ambitious. Partnerships with commercial entities are explored, though always within limits set by the estate's public mission. New revenue streams are imagined and sometimes implemented. The goal is to reduce dependence on subsidy, to create a margin of safety against future cuts, to ensure that Chambord can survive even if political winds shift. This is the hidden reality behind every grand monument that still stands, the constant struggle to translate aesthetic magnificence into sustainable economics. We see the beauty. We photograph the towers, we marvel at the double helix staircase. We do not see the spreadsheets, the budget negotiations, the difficult decisions about where to spend limited resources and what to defer. But those invisible struggles are what keep the visible beauty alive. The technological dimension of modern Chambord presents its own complexities, a layer of contemporary systems overlaid on 16th century fabric. Consider security. A building of this size and value, receiving nearly 1 million visitors annually, requires sophisticated protection. There are cameras covering public spaces. There are motion sensors in areas closed to visitors. There are alarms on doors and windows. There's a central monitoring station staffed around the clock. There are physical barriers, some visible, like rope lines and glass cases, and some invisible, like the sensors that trigger alarms if approached. All of this technology requires maintenance. Cameras fail. Sensors drift out of calibration. Software needs updating. The security team must balance effective protection against the visitor experience. Too many visible cameras and guards create an oppressive atmosphere. Too few create vulnerability. The balance is delicate and constantly reassessed. Then there is the technology of interpretation. Modern visitors expect more than bare rooms and printed labels. They expect audio guides available in multiple languages that tell stories as they walk. They expect video presentations, interactive displays, perhaps augmented reality that layers historical imagery over contemporary views. Chambord has developed these offerings steadily, though always constrained by the difficulty of installing modern equipment in historic spaces without damaging the fabric. The wireless networks that support this technology present their own challenges. Radio signals can be blocked by massive stone walls. Coverage is patchy and requires multiple access points. The equipment that powers these networks needs to be hidden from view, connected to power sources that themselves must be inconspicuous. Even something as simple as ensuring that visitors can post to social media from within the chateau requires substantial behind-the-scenes infrastructure. Climate control represents perhaps the most technically challenging domain. Museums worldwide struggle to maintain appropriate temperature and humidity for the preservation of artifacts and artwork. Chambord houses significant collections, tapestries, paintings, furniture that require stable environmental conditions to prevent deterioration. Yet the building was never designed with environmental control in mind, and retrofitting such systems is enormously difficult. The compromise is imperfect. The most sensitive objects are placed in cases or rooms where conditions can be somewhat controlled. Larger spaces fluctuate with the seasons in ways that would give a modern museum conservator nightmares. The goal is not perfect conditions, that would be impossible, but conditions good enough to slow deterioration to an acceptable rate. Energy management has become increasingly important as both costs and environmental consciousness have risen. The estate has installed solar panels on some of the service buildings, though not on the historic chateau itself. Heat recovery systems capture waste heat from mechanical equipment. LED lighting has replaced incandescent bulbs where possible. The administration tracks energy consumption monthly and sets targets for reduction. These efforts are genuine and consequential, but they operate within significant constraints. The building cannot be insulated. The walls are historic monuments, not construction surfaces. The windows cannot be replaced with double glazing. They are part of the protected fabric. The heating system cannot be eliminated. Visitors and staff and collections all require minimally acceptable conditions. Every improvement must balance energy savings against heritage protection, and heritage almost always wins. The living community at Chambord deserves particular attention, for it represents something rare in the contemporary world, a population that inhabits a historic monument not as tourists or museum staff, but as residents. Within the estate's service buildings and former domestic quarters live approximately 150 people. Some are employees of the chateau who have been granted housing as part of their compensation. Others are family members of employees. Still others are individuals with historical connections to the estate who have maintained residence rights across generations. These residents form a community unlike any other. Their children attend schools in Blois, to which they commute along the private roads of the park. They shop in the gift shop for the same souvenirs that tourists buy. They swim in the river that flows through what is technically their backyard. They watch as a million strangers pass through what is also their home. The dynamics of this community are complex. There are tensions between the needs of residents and the needs of the visiting public. There are questions about whether residential use is compatible with heritage protection. There are debates about who should be allowed to live here and under what conditions. The administration must balance its responsibility to residents against its responsibility to the broader public that owns the chateau. Yet there is also something appropriate about this living presence. Chambord was never meant to be merely an exhibit. It was meant to be inhabited, to serve human purposes, to be filled with the sounds and smells and activities of life. The current residents, however few, maintain that connection to the building's original purpose in a way that empty rooms never could. The natural world at Chambord represents both asset and obligation. The park is home to remarkable biodiversity, populations of wild boar, red deer, European mouflon, and a variety of smaller mammals, birds, and amphibians that thrive in the managed landscape. This wildlife draws visitors who come for observation and photography. It provides educational opportunities for school groups. It contributes to the sense of Chambord as a living landscape rather than a frozen moment. Yet, biodiversity does not manage itself. The deer population, unchecked, would explode and devastate the forest understory. Controlled hunting is therefore essential, a practice that continues a tradition dating to Francis IV, even as it serves contemporary ecological needs. The hunts generate income. Wealthy hunters pay significant fees for the privilege of pursuing game on these historic grounds, while also performing a necessary management function. Invasive species must be controlled, the waterways must be managed, the forest must be thinned to maintain health and reduce fire risk. All of this requires expertise and labor that adds to the estate's ongoing costs. Climate change adds new pressures. The forest composition is shifting as conditions warm. Species that once thrived at this latitude are retreating northward. Others are arriving from the south. The management plans that were appropriate for the 20th century may not be appropriate for the 21st. Adaptation is necessary, but adaptation requires resources and expertise that are always in limited supply. Let us return, finally, to where we began. The dawn mist rising over the Causson, the silence that fills the hours before the tourists arrive, the impossible outline of towers against the lightening sky. What are we looking at when we look at Chambord? We are looking at the physical residue of one man's ambition. Francis I, who wanted to build something that had never existed, who poured treasure into marshland for decades, who hardly ever slept in the building he created, but who clearly loved it in some profound way that his behavior otherwise made difficult to detect. We are looking at the labor of tens of thousands of workers across 5 centuries. The laborers who drove pilings into the mud and died of fever, the craftsmen who carved stone in the rain, the servants who carried water up endless stairs, the conservators who today spend their careers preserving what those earlier workers created. We are looking at the accumulated interventions of centuries, the changes made by later kings, the damage of revolution, the neglect of abandonment, the repairs of restoration, the technology of modern management. We are looking at a financial proposition that has never balanced, a building that has consumed far more than it has ever produced, that has survived only because successive powers have found reasons to subsidize its existence. We are looking at a tourist attraction, one of many in the Loire Valley, one of thousands in France, competing for the attention and spending of visitors who have infinite choices about where to direct their leisure. We are looking at an ecosystem, 54 square kilometers of managed landscape, with its forests and wetlands and wildlife, its relationships of predation and competition, its ongoing evolution in response to changing climate. We are looking at a community, the residents who call this place home, the workers who show up each day, the administrators who worry about budgets and conservation and visitor experience. We are looking at an idea, the idea that certain things are worth preserving simply because they exist, because they represent something about human capability and aspiration that should not be allowed to disappear. And we are looking at a question. Can something so impractical, so extravagant, so contrary to every principle of efficient resource allocation, continue to exist in a world where resources are finite and demands upon them are infinite? The answer, so far, has been yes. Chambord has survived revolution and war, abandonment and poverty, decay and neglect. It survives today through a combination of public subsidy and self-generated revenue, through the dedication of those who work there and the interest of those who visit, through adaptation that would astonish Francis I, even as it preserves his creation. But the answer has never been automatic. It has never been guaranteed. Each generation has had to make a choice to continue supporting this building, and each generation could have chosen differently. The fact that Chambord still stands is not inevitable. It is the result of decisions made and remade across 500 years that the thing is worth saving. And this is the deeper lesson that Chambord offers. We tend to assume that great buildings simply persist, that their greatness protects them, that beauty is its own justification, that monuments built to last will somehow automatically last. But this is not true. Beauty generates no income. Greatness pays no salaries. Monuments do not repair themselves. What preserves great buildings is attention, human attention continuously applied, attention in the form of money spent on maintenance and conservation, attention in the form of labor performed by skilled workers who could be doing other things, attention in the form of policy made by governments that choose to allocate resources here rather than elsewhere, attention in the form of visits made by tourists who could be going to any of 10,000 other places. When the attention stops, the decay begins. It may take years or decades to become visible, but it begins immediately. Water seeps in, stone crumbles, roof timbers rot, gardens become wilderness, and eventually, inevitably, what was built returns to earth. Chambord has survived because, for 500 years, enough people have found reasons to pay attention. The reasons have changed. Royal glory, dynastic politics, national heritage, tourist economics. But the attention has continued. Whether it will continue for another 500 years, no one can say. What we can say is that everything we admire about this building, its scale, its audacity, its beauty, exists only because someone in every decade since 1519 has made the choice to keep it existing. That choice is not made once, it is made continuously. It is being made right now in the conservation workshops where craftsmen repair eroded stone, in the administrative offices where managers balance budgets, in the legislative chambers where politicians allocate cultural funding. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It endures only through continuous effort, compromise, and service. Every sunrise that illuminates Chambord's towers represents another day that someone, somewhere, has decided to keep paying the price. And so, the mist rises from the Cosson. The light strengthens. The tourists begin to arrive, streaming through the gates that servants once guarded, climbing the stairs that kings once descended, walking through rooms where Francis I rarely slept but always imagined himself sleeping. They come from every continent. They speak every language. They carry devices that would have seemed magical to any visitor before 1900. They stay for a few hours or a few minutes, and then they leave, returning to lives that have nothing to do with 16th century hunting lodges or the ambitions of Renaissance kings. But before they leave, something happens. They look up at those towers, at that impossible profusion of chimneys and lanterns and pinnacles, and for a moment, they feel something. Wonder, perhaps. Awe. A recognition that human beings are capable of creating things larger and more beautiful than any practical purpose could justify. That feeling is Chambord's gift. It is the return on 5 centuries of investment. It is the dividend paid by all those laborers and craftsmen and servants and conservators whose names no one remembers. It is the reason why every generation, so far, has decided that the price is worth paying. Will the next generation decide the same? We cannot know. We can only hope. We can only pay attention while attention remains possible. We can only add our moment of wonder to all the moments that have come before, trusting that the moments still to come will somehow, some way, continue to accumulate. The sun climbs higher, the shadows shorten, the tourists multiply. And Chambord, vast, impractical, barely lived in, waits as it has waited for 500 years, for the attention that alone can keep it alive. If we agree that some things deserve to exist beyond their usefulness, what is our obligation to the countless hands, past, present, and future, whose labor alone makes that existence possible?